We are only 5 months into 2020 so far, and it would be an understatement to say that the year has already been kind of a mess, starting from the fears of World War III due to hostilities between US and Iran, to the massive wildfires in Australia due to climate change, to the pandemic outbreak in China that has now made its way around the world. It sure feels like we're living in those apocalyptic movies. And whether the end of the world as we know it will be from a nuclear war, a climatic event, or a medical virus, a dystopian post apocalyptic future is looking all too real right now. As you may have read about or seen movies about these kind of futures, a dystopia is a frightening society to live in, while a utopia is an ideally perfect world in terms of political systems, cultural norms, and societal conditions. A dystopia is the complete opposite. It is characterized by oppression and dehumanization. Ray Bradbury tackles this much relevant genre of dystopian literature with Fahrenheit 451. Published back in 1952, Fahrenheit 451 remains as the most popular work of Bradbury. Imagine a world where all books are banned. That may not sound so frightening because who picks up a book nowadays, right? But it goes far beyond that. Bradbury paints a picture of a dystopia where individuality and critical thinking are dissolved in a society that is indoctrinated to believe that knowledge is dangerous to the mind. This relies on censorship of all books, technological control, and repression of personal freedoms by the totalitarian police state, creating a society where citizens are more like robots than human beings, with the inability to think for themselves or acknowledge their true emotional state. Let's backtrack in time and take a look at the author and the influences that struck the creation of such a novel. Ray Bradbury was a very well-known American writer of science fiction, fantasy, and horror of the 21st century. Some of his most popular works, alongside Fahrenheit 451, that you may have heard of, include The Martian Chronicles and The Illustrated Man. Born on August 22, 1920, Ray Bradbury grew up in Illinois, United States. During his early life, Bradbury heard about the burning of books in Germany, Russia, and China at the time. He says, "When I heard about Hitler burning the books in the streets of Berlin, it bothered me terribly. I was 15 when that happened. I was thoroughly in love with libraries, and he was burning me when he did that. The reason why I wrote Fahrenheit 451 is that I am a library person, and I am in danger of someday writing something that people might not like and they might burn. So it was only natural that I sat down and wrote Fahrenheit 451. Another inspiration that really set this idea in motion came from when Bradbury was walking on the street with a friend and a police car pulled up. When asked what they were doing, Bradbury's response, putting one foot in front of the other, was not fond of by the policeman, who told him, "Don't do it again." This drove Bradbury to write the short story The Pedestrian in 1951, envisioning a time where it was considered criminal for citizens to walk outside. While the rest of society allows themselves to be trapped by the walls of their homes, to have their eyes glued to television, the protagonist is unorthodox with his long walks every evening by himself. Bradbury then turned this protagonist into Guy Montag of another technology-controlled world of Fahrenheit 451. The title actually comes from the fact that it is the temperature at which paper catches on fire and burns. Diving into the dark and gloomy setting of Fahrenheit 451, the novel takes place in a futuristic dystopian American society with the background of an elevating nuclear war. As we know, the society functions through oppression and censorship, the major element being that books are banned by the government, and this law is enforced by the firemen, whose job is to not put out fires, but ironically it is to burn any books that are found. The firemen constantly supervise citizen activities and private lives, which are not so private, and punish those who are not completely subservient to the government's absolute power. This fictional society is rooted in not-so-fictional historical connections. To understand the novel, we need to take a look back at the context or atmosphere in which the text was created. So what was happening in the 1950s? The 1950s made up the post-World War II era with a lasting devastating memory of Nazism. It was the surfacing of the Cold War with tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. This period of time was also known as the Atomic Age. The book was written not long after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, and during an escalating arms race. Bradbury reflected these fears at the time in Fahrenheit 451, where there was not only a past of atomic wars in that society, but also another nuclear annihilation surfacing in the background of their lives that eventually brought the novel to an end. Book burnings were not only associated with Nazi Germany, but it was also ongoing in several states. In the Soviet Union, writers were being sent to labor camps, and books that imposed the party's image were banned. As we know, this totalitarian government and political strategy of censorship is reflected in Fahrenheit 451. In the US, writers were also being persecuted. The House Un-American Activities Committee, an era of McCarthyism, brought political repression, blacklists, and censorship of literature and art by playing on the fear of communism as a threat to American values. Aside from this, the 50s were still overall regarded as more of a positive time in the US, as the golden age of American capitalism. There was an economic boom with increased production of cars, television, and other consumer goods. This economic prosperity and consumerism is reflected in Fahrenheit 451, where the citizens live superficial lifestyles. They appear to be happy despite the ongoing nuclear war that would destroy their city, as long as they had constant access to trivial forms of entertainment and the complexity of their lives was removed from the ban of literature and from the absence of the need for critical thinking. In particular, the 50s were the golden age of television. There was explosive growth of television's role in people's lives as a primary form of entertainment in almost every household. The main purpose was to create an audience for advertising, which shaped consumer culture in America. Bradbury feared that television would be the death of reading, which he defends as necessary to humanity. He says, television gives you the dates of Napoleon, but not who he was. Bradbury reflected this fear in Fahrenheit 451, through which he envisions a technology-obsessed and emotionally absent society if we continue in this direction. He warns us about the increasing control that technology will have over our lives and consequently risking the loss of our humanity as a result of our disconnection with the depth of the world. With that exposition needed to understand the book, let's briefly run through the plot and coinciding character development. The story follows Guy Montag, who is a fireman with the job of enforcing the ban of books. The firemen, as we established, are also on the lookout for any sense of individuality or unorthodox behavior, and are in a position of arresting those that show it. Montag comes to the realization of the true affairs of their destructive society throughout the story. His development from being a subservient citizen who is content with his job of burning books and sees nothing wrong with the political or societal systems, to a curiosity-driven rebel and enemy of the state, is necessary for Bradbury to demonstrate the possibility and hope for change in such a society. What initially started off as cultural shift became government enforced, with the banning of all literature and establishment of other laws that label intellectuals as enemies of the state, and that prevent any leisure that may act as a source of independent thinking or that may allow oneself to acknowledge their emotional state. Instead, citizens go about their daily lives by passively watching television and listening to the information that their minds are constantly fed through seashell radios in their ears. Montag's consciousness to these problems is sparked when he meets a free-spirited and unorthodox young woman, Clarice McClellan. She made him question if he was truly happy, to which his immediate thought was, "Of course I'm happy. What does she think I'm not?" But soon after, doubts were incited. He felt his smile slide away, melt, fold over, and down on itself like a tallow skin, like the stuff on a fantastic candle burning too long, and now collapsing and now blown out. Darkness. He was not happy. He wore his happiness like a mask, and the girl had run off across the lawn with the mask, and there was no way of going to knock on her door and ask for it back. His encounter with Clarice is metaphorically like the first domino that set in motion a series of turning events for Montag, including coming home that night to discover his wife Mildred's emotional emptiness after a near-death overdose on sleeping pills, shortly followed by the witnessing of a rebellious woman who chose to die in a fire when the firemen found and burned her collection of books. This drives Montag to steal books from the woman's house out of an urge to understand its value, which catches the suspicion of Captain Beatty, of the firemen, who is a representation of the strict rules that the government enforces to establish conformity and cause intellectuals or free thinkers to remain hidden in fear of getting caught. Montag's rejection of the society he lives in only continues to grow. The firemen are called down to Montag's house because his own wife had betrayed him over his illegal possession of books. The protagonist's impulse for rebellion reaches its climax when Montag uses the flamethrower with which he was ordered to burn his own home to kill Beatty instead. At this point, Montag has officially become an enemy to the state, as the police put out a city-wide broadcasted search for him, who manages to escape the city across the river and out to a place of refuge where he encounters other intellectual outcasts. The group of intellectuals explain that they are working to keep knowledge from books alive through people, by memorizing and passing down. And when the war inevitably destroys their city, which we see at the end when the bombs are dropped, we can assume that the group would likely take this opportunity to build a new foundation for their society, where knowledge is power and freedoms of thought, expression, and individuality will allow civilization to prosper. Bradbury explores several themes throughout this novel, including but not limited to censorship, ignorance, technological control, and conformity versus individuality. Let's take a look at each of these and their implications. Starting with censorship and ignorance. Censorship of literature is the totalitarian government's political strategy of maintaining power and control over the knowledge and expression of the citizens, thus repressing these freedoms, which is a characteristic of dystopian societies. This resembles the real-life world censorship in dictatorial states, where citizens are prohibited from accessing any information outside the government's control that is politically unacceptable or threatening to their values. This type of system is perceived as ideal by the average blinded citizen themselves in Fahrenheit 451 because of the sense of stability of society that would otherwise be threatened, whereas in the past there were conflicting opinions, offensiveness, and complexity due to people being exposed to different information through books and people being able to freely express their thoughts and emotions. Captain Beatty gives Montag a speech about their society's history that has led to the banning of books, explaining why the public stopped reading on its own accord. He says, "If you don't want a house built, hide the nails in wood. If you don't want a man unhappy politically, don't give him two sides to a question to worry him. Give him one. Better yet, give him none. Let him forget there is such a thing as war." When citizens are all fed the same factual information, this rids the need for the act of critical thinking, which is perceived to lead to melancholy and unnecessary worry, and which is why too few even desire to reject the societal systems anymore. This creates the illusion of a perfect society where everyone appears to be happy, which actually reveals the ignorance of the citizens with their dismissal of the reality of their oppression for the sake of the removal of complexity from their lives that would come if they were to let their thoughts and emotions in. Contributing to the society's ignorance is the next theme of technological control. Unlike reading and leisure time that allow people to pause, question the information they're retaining, and have their own perception on it, the televisions and seashell radios that the citizens give their undivided attention to tell people what to think. And through this technology, the government is able to have complete control over the citizens' knowledge and expression. This, once again, is perceived as ideal by the average blinded citizen because of the instant satisfaction that it provides. This reflects our modern-day desire for everything to be immediate in such a fast-paced society as the one depicted in Fahrenheit 451. Montag's wife, Mildred, is a prime representation of this average brainwashed citizen. Mildred is essentially held captive to the 3 television walls enclosing her and the seashell radio in her ear, with unacknowledgement of her own inner unhappiness and her suicide attempt, or denial to have any real sense of communication or emotional connection with her husband. She is rather living robotically by not coming to terms with her true emotional state, free thoughts, or the issues in which she is slowly drowning. This again connects back to the illusion of a perfect society where this numbness and spiritual emptiness is mistaken for happiness by the superficial desires of the citizens, because they don't know any better without being able to think for themselves or express such thoughts. Having this technological control over the citizens also allows for manipulation by the totalitarian government. For example, feeding the citizens omissive information about the surfacing nuclear war. As he walked, he was listening to the seashell radio in one ear. "We have mobilized 1,000,000 men. Quick victory is ours if the war comes." Music flooded over the voice quickly, and it was gone. 10 million men mobilized, Faber's voice whispered in his other ear. But say 1 million, it's happier. The use of technology to direct people's thoughts and perception in favor of what the government wants everyone to know and restrict what they don't need to know keeps citizens compliant in their thoughts and behaviors towards the absolute power of the government. This makes them targets of deception and fabrication, which are methods used to keep citizens convinced that their current societal system is indeed ideal and reduce their willingness to attempt to revolt against what is expected of them. However, as with other characteristic dystopian literature, there are individuals that do challenge the system, which brings us to the next theme of conformity versus individuality. People like Clarice are different from the rest of society because of their will to hold on to independent thought rather than submit to the values of the state, despite the extreme efforts of the government to completely indoctrinate the masses. The fact that she suddenly ended up dead due to a supposed speeding car, not long after Captain Beatty realized that it was her who sparked changes to Montague's perceptions, does not stray far from the idea that her death wasn't an accident. Her unconstrained free will and unorthodox behavior, and lack of fear of hiding it, is what got her dead in a society that has no tolerance for individuality. Captain Beatty of the Firemen describes these societal values when he says, "The word intellectual, of course, became the swear word it deserved to be. You always dread the unfamiliar. We must all be alike. Not everyone born free and equal, as the Constitution says, but everyone made equal, each man the image of every other. Then all are happy." With no man being more knowledgeable than the next, this is perceived to ensure happiness, which is why intellectuals are viewed as a threat to the stability of society. The fear of intellectuals wasn't created by the government, it rose as a societal shift. Rather, the government acts on this fear and enforces it politically through censorship, to keep citizens convinced by the sense of complete equality that it brings. However, to what extent is this sense of complete equality harmful? Having everyone forced to think and act the same way, with no difference in perception or opinions, means taking away their freedom of thought and expression. The right to independent thought, access to information, and expression of opinions are all essential for humanity, as it allows us to make change where needed and thus progress as a species. So the repression of these freedoms, and hence a loss of humanity, are the consequences that make this type of society an unfavorable and destructive world to live in. Throughout the novel, Montague depicts the traits of a dystopian protagonist, challenging the system of conformity as he reveals himself to have an increasing hold over his individual identity, rather than being completely submissive and brainwashed to follow the behavior that is perceived by the rest of society as orthodox. At the end of the novel, Montague, along with the group of intellectuals he meets in hiding, are the nonconformists who will fight for change to the political and societal system as a resolution to this dystopia. Now that we've established the themes, what can we learn from this book when we consider it all again from a lens perspective this time, specifically a Marxist lens? First off, what does it mean to look at literature from a Marxist lens? According to Karl Marx, human beings are the product of their social and economic environment. Part of the Marxist theory is that the economic conditions form the base of society. This includes the relations of production, such as between the proletariat and bourgeoisie, and the means of production. This then influences the superstructure of society, which is everything from law, media, politics, science, to art, culture, religion, philosophy. Marxism considers a piece of literature to be an expression of class struggle, reflecting the social and political conditions of the time. It questions if the literature is a mirror of social values or if it is intended to challenge these norms. To analyze a novel from this perspective, we need to first revisit the context in order to understand the historical conditions at the time and the influence of class conflict in the author's environment that produced this text. As we discussed earlier, Fahrenheit 451 was produced in the 1950s, which was the time not long after World War II and Nazism came to an end, including the book burnings of those that expressed ideologies that opposed the totalitarian regime of Hitler. It was also the time of the surfacing of the Cold War and the atomic age. It was a time of censorship in the Soviet Union, another totalitarian regime under Stalin. It was also a time of the golden age of American capitalism, the economic boom and shaping of consumer culture, with increased production of television, cars, and other consumer goods. It was also a time of the widespread fear of communism as a threat to American values, involving censorship to prey on this fear. Fahrenheit 451 is a reflection of the political and social values of the atmosphere in which it was written. Ray Bradbury criticizes the totalitarian government of the state in the novel that enforces strict obedience to authority at the expense of personal freedoms, by revealing how the ruling class maintains power over the masses through false consciousness of reality. The ruling class, or the bourgeoisie, imposes its ideology that knowledge is dangerous to the mind, by prohibiting books and other sources of independent thought outside of the government's control. This form of censorship is intended to serve in favor of the ruling class's sole desire for power, as it allows them to maintain the submissiveness of the masses by eliminating the power of knowledge. And Bradbury reveals this exploitation of the proletariat through Mildred, her friends, and the average blinded citizen who are indoctrinated by the propaganda of the ruling class. As a result of this exploitation, the ignorance and triviality among the masses produces a society that is reshaped to prefer materialistic pleasure to satisfy needs over intellectual awareness of beliefs and morals. The average citizen is viewed as no more than a commodity, as they are stripped of the dignity that makes them a human being. Bradbury opens the eyes of readers to this consequence of mass consumer culture, reflected by the compulsion of Mildred and other citizens to the televisions and seashell radios through which the cycle of political propaganda continues. He saw her leaning toward the great shimmering walls of color and motion, where the family talked and talked and talked to her, where the family prattled and chatted and said her name and smiled at her, and said nothing of the bomb that was an inch, now a half inch, now a quarter inch from the top of the hotel, leaning into the wall as if all the hunger of looking would find the secret of her sleepless unease there. Mildred leaning anxiously, nervously, as if to plunge, drop, fall into that swarming immensity of color to drown in its bright happiness. The masses value these shallow forms of entertainment over the state of their own lives. As material desires increase, the mental power of books in making the citizens politically and socially aware of the world becomes eradicated. The result is a mindless or emotionally absent society that is convinced by the false construction of happiness that the ruling class preys on for their own benefit. The work is intended to not merely reflect the real-life class conflict of oppression and exploitation of the proletariat by the ruling class in the world behind the text, but also challenge this basic pattern in history. The Marxist theory believes in the inevitable seizure of power through the revolution of the proletariat, collectively ending their own oppression. This theory hopes for a state of balance in the future, for a more secure place to live in. In Fahrenheit 451, Bradbury defends the position of the oppressed citizens against the absolute power of the government. He demonstrates the potential for change to the political and societal systems by supporting the few nonconformist intellectuals within an unconscious society and their willingness to revolt. This riot is represented by Montag, who not merely survives at the end of the novel while the rest of the city is destroyed by the atomic bombs, but moreover thrives, since he encounters a group of intellectuals taking refuge in the wilderness outside the city, whose efforts are to keep knowledge from books alive and passed on through people. All we want to do is keep the knowledge we think we will need intact and safe. We're not out to incite or anger anyone yet. Right now we have a horrible job. We're waiting for the war to begin and as quickly end. It's not pleasant, but then we're not in control. We're the odd minority crying in the wilderness. When the war's over, perhaps we can be of some use in the world. But you can't make people listen. They have to come round in their own time, wondering what happened and why the world blew up under them. It can't last. This group is the educated intellectual resistance within the proletariat that will collectively cause an uprising in taking the opportunity of the city's destruction to rebuild their society with the foundation of knowledge, which is believed by Bradbury to be the key to progression and humanity. Bradbury's use of symbolism throughout the novel can also be looked at through a Marxist perspective. The symbols are an enhancement of the idea of the inevitability of the proletariat revolution. First off, the recurring symbol of fire. Burn all, burn everything. Fire is bright and fire is clean. Fire is the fourth element of creation, a critical energy force in sustaining life. Fire can burn and destroy, as it is used in the novel for burning books as the means of destroying knowledge and humanity. However, fire is also attributed with transformation and purification. At the end of the novel, it is significant that Montag's meeting of the group of the intellectuals occurs around a fire. In this case, the fire brings together human minds, which will predestine a brighter future through the transformation of society. Similarly, another symbol mentioned is the phoenix. There was a silly damn bird called a phoenix back before Christ. Every few hundred years he built a pyre and built himself up. He must have been the first cousin to man, but every time he burned himself up, he sprung out of the ashes. He got himself born all over again. The phoenix is a symbol of death and rebirth. Its invincibility, as it will always rise from the ashes, attributes strength to the group of intellectual resistance in the novel that will use knowledge to direct the ultimate renewal of society despite the damage that has been prolonged by the hands of the ruling class. Through the consistent use of such symbols, Bradbury further expresses his hopes for civilization to be liberated, in defense of those who have been victims of exploitation and loss of freedoms due to class struggle. So now that we've been able to apply the Marxist theory, what is the book trying to say using this lens? The novel is a criticism of the real world's capitalism, from which inequality and class conflict arise. Those in positions of power in a capitalist society act in such a way that solely serves their status. As described earlier, they view those below them as commodities rather than human beings, since the masses are necessary to them as the source of their money and power. This is where power corrupts, because with maintaining status as the only intention, the needs of the people are no longer a priority. In Fahrenheit 451, the citizens' mass consumerism is what feeds the power of the government. This is only maintained if the citizens are blind to this exploitation, which is ensured through repressing their freedoms and rights to knowledge, independent thought, and expression. This strips the citizens of everything that makes them human beings, creating an unjust society that functions on inequality and corruption. Through critiquing the trivial priorities of the upper class, the book attempts to open our eyes to the underlying intentions of the real world's capitalist society, to serve power and wealth no matter the cost, which includes zero authentic interest in the needs or rights of the masses. The term authentic is key here, because in Fahrenheit 451, the brainwashed citizens are convinced that the government has their best interests in mind by prohibiting their access to knowledge that is dangerous to their mind, which is a false consciousness of reality. This reflects how the capitalist system appears on the surface to be anything but deceitful, hiding the exploitation that constructs it all, which Bradbury attempts to expose through such a novel. To end off this thought, I'd like to share an interesting quote that I actually just came across randomly while I was making this, but it happens to relate to the overall idea of the desire for power. This quote is said by Jimi Hendrix, who was an influential American guitarist and well-celebrated musician of the 20th century. He says, "When the power of love overcomes the love of power, the world will know peace." So we've established the clear historical connections of the novel as a product of the political and social environment in which it was written. So we know that the world described in this science fiction novel can happen here, making it not so science fiction after all. However, it isn't merely a reflection of the world that the author lived in back in the 50s. Fahrenheit 451 stands the test of time, as Bradbury warns us about the circumstances of our contemporary world today as well, giving us something to learn about the direction that we are heading. Starting with the prolonged existence of government censorship around the world. The extreme secrecy of North Korea's dictatorial state is a prime example of censorship that remains today. The government owns all the news outlets, and all journalists are part of the ruling party. Access to any information outside these sources is restricted, and the radios and TVs are set to government stations, and they must be checked by the police. Internet access is censored as well and is exclusive to certain higher class members and schools with their own form called intranet, which only provides users with information that is politically acceptable. Censorship contributes to the severe oppression of the citizens of North Korea, as they are deprived of freedoms of thought, expression, religion, etc., that are essential to their humanity. This political strategy creates the illusion of a perfect society in the eyes of their citizens, like we talked about in Fahrenheit 451. In North Korea, since the citizens lack outside knowledge on what the rest of the world looks like, the government is able to distort their vision and paint a picture of their societal systems being ideal in contrast to the outside world, which ensures the strict obedience of their citizens. Another significant connection that Bradbury makes between the novel and our world today is the use of the dehumanized citizens to warn us about the consequences of a technology-obsessed world. As argued by Bradbury himself to be the most important message to take away from the novel, he opens our eyes to the loss of critical thinking and emotional fulfillment as a result of the superficial lifestyles that humans are leading. Fahrenheit 451 is particularly relevant with where we stand in our modern age of technology and social media. At the time the text was written in the 50s, there was an economic boom in advancements of technology, including the explosive popularity of television and other consumer goods, and the addiction of the average citizen in the novel to the television walls and the seashell radios is Bradbury's prediction of the real-life addiction of future generations to the materialism that technology brings. In our fast-paced society, it is desirable for everything to be immediate. Forget picking up a book. With the easy attainability of any information that we need at the touch of a button through our digital devices, we have the tendency to only scratch the surface of the information that we attain, ridding the need for critical thinking. Scientists have reported that the attention span of humans has dropped from 12 seconds in 2000 to 8 seconds today, which is less than that of a goldfish. This embodies how the rapid advancement of technology and its role in our daily lives has influenced our desire for instant satisfaction, like the citizens of Fahrenheit 451, who are both living mentally and emotionally absent, which makes them not so alive after all. With this novel, Bradbury is warning readers about the consequence of allowing modern conveniences to consume us, as he feared humans would be losing touch with reality and losing touch with what makes us human and distincts us from other species. The capacity of our brain for using knowledge and communication as a tool, along with our capacity for emotions, with which we lead our mind and body to make change where necessary. In addition, our generation is experiencing the age of social media. Social media appears as though it is intended to connect us, but ironically, hasn't it resulted in a society that is more disconnected to the world in front of us? We allow the media to dictate so many of our thoughts and behaviors, which then allows the construction of a false perception of reality. The information that we are fed steers us away from the evidence of our own senses. This reflects an increased susceptibility to propaganda and deception through these media platforms, of which we forget the underlying intentions, to favor corporate interests, not the interests of the public. Bradbury warns us about this in Fahrenheit 451 through putting the reader in an observer's position where we can see the citizens being exploited by political propaganda. This prompts self-reflection on how much control we truly have over our own thoughts in the atmosphere we live in, where corporations have us consumers on a string, directing our desire for superficial lifestyles with modern conveniences because of the benefit that it feeds them, which we don't think about when we are blinded by instant satisfaction. To come full circle to the frightening time that is our year of 2020 so far, the last thing that is worth discussing before we end off this episode is the current state of affairs in the world. We are in the midst of the global pandemic, COVID-19, that was unforeseen and escalated at unprecedented rates. We won't be able to get through this challenge together if we go through it blindly. Some of us don't see the severity of what is happening right outside our home that we are stuck in. But while we view quarantine as being stuck at home, the people on the outside must envy that we are safe at home. Each day is a battle for the infected, the families mourning deaths, and the workers risking their lives to provide for the rest of our safety. Yet hearing all the case numbers in the news each day don't truly mean anything to us when we are so focused on ensuring that we are being entertained at home. And while we seek to satisfy these materialistic desires, we forget the state of our own lives and the lives of those on the outside. And if we look up from our screen, we might open our eyes to the triviality and ignorance that this is spreading. As Bradbury believes, knowledge is indeed power. Being politically and socially aware is power. It is what will direct us to prioritize the needs of the essential workers and those fighting the virus, far above the superficial desires of those of us that don't see the value in having the opportunity to stay home. In this way, awareness is what is needed to ensure that we don't go through this crisis blindly, unlike the citizens in Fahrenheit 451, whose triviality and ignorance overpowered their willingness to see the severity of the conditions of the world around them. Thus, they lacked the ability to see that their world was collapsing right underneath their nose, which brought their society to its inevitable end. With this, Bradbury stresses the weight of knowledge as being essential to our humanity, not merely